So there I was, 52 years old, sitting in a conference room thinking about how I was finally going to cash out my stock options in 72 hours. Then the door slammed open like someone was announcing a raid. Preston Hudson walked in wearing that smirk you see on kids who've never been told no in their lives. Designer suit, expensive watch, and the kind of confidence that comes from having Daddy's name on the building. He threw a manila envelope across the table and said, "Effective immediately. HR will handle your transition. I'm Nathan Cross, by the way." And this punk had just handed me my walking papers exactly 72 hours before my 400K stock options were supposed to vest. Look, Preston thought he was being clever. Cut the old engineer loose before the big payout, save the company some cash. What he didn't know was that he'd just activated something in my contract that would blow up his family's entire financial world. I looked down at the termination letter. Clean corporate language, all proper and legal. What it didn't mention was that every patent I'd created over the past 15 years, 18 military-grade patents worth about $320 million, had a little clause attached. See, when I signed my original contract, I'd insisted that any patents requiring my ongoing cooperation for licensing or transfer would need my completed vesting to be fully assigned to the company. The company lawyers had signed off on it back then, probably figured it was just technical mumbo-jumbo that would never matter. After all, who fires their lead engineer right before a major acquisition? Preston was already heading for the door, checking his phone like firing people was just another item on his to-do list. I didn't say anything. Didn't need to. In 72 hours, he'd learn what happens when MBA types try to outsmart engineers who actually read their contracts. Here's the thing. I didn't start out planning any of this. Back in 1998, I was just a 26-year-old getting out of the Air Force after 8 years flying F-16s. Spent a couple years doing graduate work at Colorado State, then some consulting gigs until 2008 when I joined Storm Point Defense. The company was maybe 20 people crammed into a converted warehouse, working on autonomous systems for military applications. The coffee was terrible, the heating barely worked, but we believed we could revolutionize how the military used unmanned vehicles. This was right when the Pentagon was getting serious about drone technology, and we were positioned perfectly. Back then, Charles Hudson, Preston's father, was just Chuck, the numbers guy making sure we could afford rent and server hosting. Preston was probably still in high school, showing up occasionally at company barbecues with that entitled air of someone who'd never worried about making payroll. I wasn't just writing code or filing patent applications. I was designing the fundamental architecture that would become our competitive edge. Late nights in the lab, I developed the guidance, systems that let drones navigate hostile territory without GPS jamming. Weekend sessions produced the AI algorithms that could identify targets and threats in real time, even in sandstorm conditions. Every breakthrough, every innovation that made us valuable had my fingerprints on it. The Pentagon wanted systems that could operate independently in communications-denied environments. I gave them exactly that. The patents started flowing by year 3. Autonomous navigation for combat zones, predictive maintenance for military vehicles, battlefield communication protocols that could adapt to interference. Each application listed me as the primary inventor, with Storm Point Defense as the assignee. But here's where it gets interesting. During my initial contract negotiations, fresh out of consulting and loaded with technical knowledge but still learning the business side, I'd gotten some advice from a lawyer buddy. He told me to make sure any patents requiring my personal expertise for implementation would need completed vesting for full company ownership. It seemed reasonable at the time. The company gets the patents, but if they fire me before I'm fully vested, they'd need my cooperation to actually use them. Storm Point's lawyers barely glanced at it. They were more worried about non-compete agreements and salary structures. A patent cooperation clause triggered by incomplete vesting? Seemed like a technicality that would never come up. After all, why would you fire your lead engineer right before he's fully vested? By year 7, those patents were generating serious money. Defense contractors like Raytheon and General Dynamics paid 8 figures annually just to license our navigation systems. The Pentagon was our biggest client, along with 3 major aerospace companies. I wasn't just an employee anymore. I was the technical backbone holding up an increasingly valuable operation. Every board presentation included slides showcasing our IP portfolio. Every investor pitch highlighted our defensible technology moat, Every acquisition conversation started with detailed reviews of our patent assets, and sitting at the center of it all was my work, protected by patents, generating revenue, making StormPoint Defense attractive to buyers. Charles Hudson's quarterly reports always had a section on intellectual property value. The numbers were solid: $25 million in annual licensing revenue, $320 million in estimated portfolio value, projections showing continued growth as military automation expanded into new theaters. What those reports didn't mention was that most of that value came from patents where Nathan Cross was listed as the primary inventor. And thanks to that little clause I'd negotiated 15 years ago, actually using those patents required my active cooperation. Something Preston was about to learn the hard way. I watched Preston grow up during those 15 years. College kid to confident young executive with his MBA from Wharton and his father's analytical mind. He joined officially 3 years ago as Director of Strategic Operations, a role that seemed custom designed to give him executive experience without requiring actual results. In meetings, he spoke with the casual authority of someone who'd inherited access rather than earned it. He used phrases like optimizing operational synergies and leveraging core competencies, while the rest of us dealt with the reality of building systems that had to work when people's lives depended on them. The thing is, Preston was smart. I'll give him that. He understood that perception often mattered more than substance in corporate environments. He cultivated relationships with board members, spoke their language of quarterly metrics and strategic positioning, gradually positioned himself as someone who understood both the technology and the business side. Here's the funny thing about Preston. He was right about understanding business. He just never bothered understanding the technical foundations that business was built on. He knew our patents were valuable, but never read the actual applications or checked the cooperation clauses. He knew licensing revenue was important, but never tracked where those licenses originated or what it took to maintain them. So when he walked into that conference room and handed me my termination letter, he was making what he thought was a calculated business decision. Cut the high-salary engineer before his stock vests, save $400K, move forward with the acquisition using company assets he assumed would work just fine without me. He had no idea he'd just activated a clause that would make those assets essentially worthless. The acquisition he was so confident about? Titan Industries had been circling us for 14 months, planning a $750 million buyout. These weren't some startup looking to flip us. Titan was serious defense contractor money, the kind of company that builds aircraft carriers and missile defense systems. They weren't interested in our brand or our client relationships. They wanted our patent portfolio, specifically the autonomous systems patents that would form the foundation of their expansion into next-generation military robotics. The Pentagon was pushing for fully autonomous battlefield support, and our technology was exactly what they needed. The due diligence had been exhaustive. Titan's technical team spent weeks reviewing every patent application, every piece of documentation I'd generated over 15 years. Their CEO, Andrew Walsh, and technical director, Lisa Park, had conducted independent assessments, brought in consultants from Lockheed and Boeing, run their own tests on our prototype systems. 3 weeks before Preston fired me, I'd gotten an email from Lisa with the subject line, "Final technical validation complete." Her message was brief but definitive. All systems exceed specifications. Recommend immediate board approval for acquisition. That email was Titan's green light. The technology worked. The patents were solid. The integration plan was feasible. But buried in the legal documentation was my cooperation clause. Titan's lawyers had noted it during their review and flagged it as a potential risk. See, most patents in defense technology aren't just legal documents. They're blueprints for systems that require ongoing technical support. You can own the patent, but if you don't have the guy who designed it helping you implement it, you're basically buying expensive paperwork. Titan's legal team had requested clarification from StormPoint about these cooperation requirements. Charles's lawyers had responded with a memo explaining that the clauses were just standard technical support provisions, unlikely to ever be an issue since the company had no intention of terminating key personnel before major acquisitions. That response was buried in hundreds of pages of legal documents. I doubt Preston ever saw it. He was focused on the big picture: purchase price, closing timeline, his family's exit strategy. He wasn't reading employment contract details or thinking about what requires inventor cooperation for implementation actually meant in the real world. Look, I should probably mention something here. The morning after Preston handed me that letter, I wasn't sitting around feeling sorry for myself. I was in my home office, and this wasn't just some casual workspace with a laptop on the kitchen table. This was a serious technical environment. Enterprise-grade equipment, redundant network connections, security protocols that would make StormPoint's IT team jealous. The walls were covered with system diagrams, patent sketches, and technical notes representing 15 years of research. Everything important I'd ever worked on had been documented here first, then refined and tested before making its way into official company systems. I powered up my workstation and logged into my secure environment. The main dashboard showed exactly what I expected. A countdown timer reading 71 hours, 23 minutes, and 47 seconds. No drama, no sound effects, just time moving steadily toward a deadline that would change everything. The patent portfolio that was about to require my active cooperation. 18 major patents covering autonomous defense systems, battlefield AI, and drone guidance protocols. Current estimated value according to corporate insurance assessments, $320 million. Annual licensing revenue that depended on my technical support, $25 million. In 71 hours, Preston's $400K cost-saving measure would make $320 million worth of patents essentially unusable without my cooperation. And I wasn't feeling particularly cooperative. Next, I opened a secure folder and began reviewing the technical safeguards I'd built over the years. Patent documentation stored in encrypted repositories with biometric authentication. Source code backed up across multiple secure cloud platforms with ITAR compliance protocols. Research data protected by security clearance level access. Controls that only I could authorize. See, here's what Preston didn't understand about defense technology patents. It's not like consumer tech where you can hand the documentation to any decent engineer and they'll figure it out. These systems were designed to operate in environments where enemy forces are actively trying to jam, hack, or destroy them. The implementation details aren't just technical, they're classified. Even if StormPoint wanted to maintain the patents without me, they'd need my cooperation to access the underlying technical documentation that made those patents actually work, and they definitely wouldn't get that cooperation. I opened my secure email and found the draft message I'd prepared months ago as contingency planning. Smart engineers always have backup plans. Subject line, technical cooperation notice regarding patent portfolio. The message was straightforward. Effective at countdown completion, ongoing technical cooperation for patents will require renegotiation per original employment contract provisions. Please contact me directly regarding future arrangements. The email was scheduled to send automatically when my vesting deadline passed. Just an automated notification that would inform Titan the technical support they thought came with their acquisition was no longer part of the package. The first call came exactly 34 hours before the deadline. Caller ID showed Titan's headquarters area code. Mr. Cross, this is Jennifer Walsh, General Counsel for Titan Industries. Do you have a few minutes to discuss some questions? I settled back in my chair, watching the countdown continue. Sure, what kind of questions? We've been conducting final due diligence, and some concerns have emerged regarding technical cooperation requirements for your patent portfolio. What kind of concerns? We're trying to understand the current status of ongoing technical support obligations. Our review shows cooperation clauses tied to your employment status. I let silence stretch. The cooperation requirements are standard for my employment agreement. Something specific you need clarified? Well, Jennifer continued carefully, our understanding was that technical support would transfer with the patents. However, we've discovered language suggesting cooperation could be interrupted under certain circumstances. That's correct. Technical cooperation requires my completed vesting with StormPoint. If employment gets terminated before options vest, we'd need to renegotiate support terms directly. The pause was long enough for me to imagine Jennifer scanning legal documents, making rapid calculations about what this meant for Titan's $750 million deal. Could you confirm your current employment status? I was terminated yesterday morning. My vesting was scheduled to complete in approximately 33 hours. Jennifer was processing that Titan had spent 14 months negotiating to acquire patents requiring separate technical agreements with someone who no longer worked. For the seller, would you participate in a conference call with our executive team this afternoon? I'm available, but the cooperation requirements are contractual. There's no mechanism to extend them without new agreements. The afternoon call included Andrew Walsh, Lisa Park, and Jennifer. Andrew's voice carried controlled tension of an executive watching his acquisition develop complications. "Mr. Cross, help me understand the scope. Which patents require your ongoing cooperation?" I pulled up my portfolio. 18 patents covering autonomous systems, battlefield AI, and drone guidance. These represent approximately 90% of the technical value in the StormPoint acquisition. Silence. Someone exhaled slowly. "Those are the core patents," Lisa said flatly. "Without ongoing technical support, implementation becomes exponentially more difficult." "That's correct. The remaining patents don't require specialized implementation support." Andrew's voice took on the careful tone of crisis management. "Is there any way to extend these cooperation requirements? Any transition periods?" "The cooperation terms are tied to my vesting schedule. Once that deadline passes tomorrow, we'd need entirely new agreements." "What about direct technical consulting arrangements with you personally?" This was the opening I'd been expecting. I'd be open to consulting discussions, but my priorities would be different from StormPoint's. I'm interested in working with organizations that understand the technology and respect the engineering expertise behind it. The subtext was clear. Titan's team had always treated me as a valued partner, while StormPoint's leadership had just demonstrated their disregard by terminating me before a major acquisition. "We absolutely respect the engineering," Lisa said quickly. "We've always seen you as essential to making this technology work at our scale. I appreciate that. When my StormPoint obligations end tomorrow, I'll be positioned to discuss consulting arrangements that make sense for both parties." Andrew's relief was audible. "That's very encouraging." The call continued, covering technical details, but the essential points were established. Titan couldn't acquire functional patents from StormPoint because StormPoint would lose access to required technical cooperation, but they could potentially contract directly with me under terms giving me significantly more control and compensation than I'd ever received as an employee. When we ended the call, I sat back and allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The next morning brought a call from Charles Hudson at 8:23 a.m., less than 9 hours before my vesting deadline. His voice was tight with stress and completely lacking the polished confidence I'd heard in 15 years of board meetings. "Nathan, we need to talk. Titan called me at home last night. They're threatening to restructure the entire acquisition." "Good morning, Charles." "Good morning, nothing," he snapped. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This cooperation clause situation. When were you planning to tell us about the implications?" The question revealed everything I needed to know about the panic consuming StormPoint's leadership. Charles Hudson, the CFO who'd overseen every major financial decision for the past decade, was just learning about contract provisions that had been in my employment agreement for 15 years. The cooperation requirements have been in my contract since I was hired. They were negotiated during my initial employment discussions. Your legal team reviewed and approved them. Nobody remembers contract details from 15 years ago. I do, and I assumed your legal team maintained proper documentation of employment agreements, especially for key personnel involved in major acquisitions. The silence stretched long enough for me to imagine Charles pulling up contract files, scanning legal documents, realizing this catastrophic oversight was entirely self-inflicted. "Nathan, let's be practical about this," he said finally, his voice shifting to the negotiating tone I'd heard him use with difficult clients. "Preston made a mistake. I'm willing to acknowledge that. What do you need to make this right? Reinstatement, accelerated vesting, a promotion? Charles, the cooperation requirements are contractual. They execute automatically when my vesting deadline passes. There's no mechanism to stop or reverse them. There has to be something. This deal is worth $750 million. My family's entire financial future depends on StormPoint's exit strategy. If the Titan acquisition failed, StormPoint would lose its primary exit opportunity. The company would remain valuable, but not at the inflated levels that made the Hudson family wealthy beyond their current means. Preston's mistake wouldn't just cost them acquisition proceeds, it would trap them in a company they'd been planning to cash out of. I understand what this means for your family, but the legal framework is clear. In 8 hours, Titan will need separate agreements with me for any technical cooperation on those patents. What about consulting arrangements? If you work directly with them, you could still support the acquisition. I could provide consulting services. But that would require new negotiations. New terms, probably a very different financial structure. Titan wanted integrated technical support as part of their acquisition, not separate consulting contracts with former StormPoint employees. Charles exhaled sharply. What are your terms? I haven't finalized terms yet. When my StormPoint obligations end this afternoon, I'll be able to consider various arrangements. But Titan has already indicated they want to discuss direct consulting agreements. The implications hit him immediately. If Titan could get the technical support they needed through consulting contracts with me, they didn't need to pay $750 million to acquire StormPoint at all. At exactly 5:00 p.m., my countdown timer reached 0. Vesting deadline passed. Cooperation obligations terminated. No drama, just the quiet execution of contractual provisions that had been set in motion 15 years ago and triggered by Preston Hudson's decision 72 hours earlier. My phone started buzzing immediately. Charles's number, then Preston's, then several other StormPoint executives. I let them all go to voicemail. Instead, I answered when Titan called. Mr. Cross, this is Andrew. First, let me say we're impressed by your professionalism throughout this situation. Second, we'd like to schedule a meeting tomorrow morning to discuss consulting terms. When were you thinking? How about 9 a.m.? This is our absolute top priority. That works for me. The next morning brought an unexpected knock at my door. Through the security camera, I saw Preston Hudson looking like he hadn't slept in 3 days. Alone, no lawyers, no advisors. I opened the door. Preston. Nathan, I screwed up so badly I don't even know how to fix it. Yes, you did. Coffee? He nodded and sat heavily on my couch. Titan restructured their offer this morning. They're acquiring our manufacturing facilities and client contracts for $150 million, then contracting directly with you for technical services. My father's retirement plan just lost $600 million. That makes sense from their perspective. They get the technology support they need without paying for assets they can't actually use. My father's entire financial future was based on that $750 million acquisition. I destroyed it because I wanted to save $400K on your vesting. You destroyed it because you made a personnel decision without understanding the technical dependencies. Preston put his head in his hands. Is there any way to fix this? There might be. But it would require acknowledging some realities your family has avoided for 15 years. What do you mean? I built the technology that made StormPoint valuable. My patents generate $25 million annually. My expertise is why Titan wanted to acquire your company. For 15 years, your family benefited from my work while treating me like a replaceable component. You're absolutely right. If you want to discuss arrangements that allow StormPoint to remain viable, we can do that. But it would be as partners, not employer and employee, under terms that reflect the actual value I bring. What kind of terms? Joint venture structure. 50% ownership of any new developments. Exclusive consulting agreements require my approval, and a formal acknowledgement about how this situation was handled. Done. Whatever you want. 6 months later, I'm running cross-defense solutions from a new office overlooking Colorado Springs. The consulting contract with Titan generates $8 million annually. The joint venture with StormPoint has produced 3 new patent applications. Preston calls monthly now, different tone than that conference room encounter. He's learned expensive lessons about respecting expertise and reading contracts carefully. Sometimes I think about that moment when Preston walked in confident he was making a smart business decision. He thought he was saving $400K. Instead, he gave me control over $320 million in technical assets and taught me the most valuable lesson of my career. The best revenge isn't emotional. It's building something so valuable that everyone who underestimated you has no choice but to acknowledge what you're actually worth.